Chair, we are live.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to meeting number 6 of the Tree Advisory Board Adhoc Committee. This is our second to last meeting. We've got lots of fun things to get accomplished tonight. So to start, Lisa, would you mind taking roll?
Sure. Just going to go down our list here. Alan Billingsley.
I'm here.
Great. And John Boatman. Not yet. Ed Brooks is excused. Ticomir Dunlap.
Here.
Okay. Jean Ellers.
Jean, present.
Thank you. Jesse Gamble is excused. Micah Glastetter.
Mr. Glastetter is just now joining the meeting.
Oh, great. Micah, we're going to mark you present. Melissa Jackson.
Present.
Hank Jones.
Here.
Sean Martin. Not yet. Maya Neff.
Here.
Great. Jesse Black is resigned. And then Denise Nicole Franklin. Denise, are you muted?
Present.
Thank you. Great. Chair, that's our roll call for now.
Okay. Are there any corrections to the meeting minutes from our last meeting? Corrections or changes? Okay. I'm going to move that we accept the minutes from April 12th.
I'll second.
Thank you.
It was moved by Chair Jackson and seconded by Mr. Billingsley that the meetings be approved.
Okay. And now we move on to some more code evaluation options.
Chair Jackson, I do want to let you know that Mr. Masters was able to join us. He
good.
is on the call.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, from
did we take a vote?
For
Approval of the minutes.
Right, I believe there was a first and second, but I don't believe there was a vote.
oh, there was not a vote, so we can vote.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Seeing lots of hands. Any opposed? The ayes have it.
Okay, Lisa, you had mentioned earlier that you hadn't received any questions for our guest tonight, and so perhaps we could address some questions later as we get down and into the questions or into our discussions.
Yes, that makes sense. As we get to that item, we now have our guest from WDFW here. So when we go over that motion, or that potential motion, we can field questions then.
Okay. And then I don't know if we want to do just a quick review of what we did decide on last week, but basically our recommendations were to try to increase the tree canopy by about 40% is what we ended up deciding. And then we got a little bit stuck on the second discussion, the second key issue, which was the residential lots exemption. So I don't know if we just want to pick it up from there.
That sounds good. I can share a screen. I think, as I remember, Chair, the group felt that it was premature to vote on a residential lot exemption without seeing the incentives that may be a part of the package. And so later in the list of motions, we do have some incentives. So I can share my screen and we can look at the residential lot exemption issue.
Okay.
Okay, I'm sharing from the packet. We're on key issue number 2, residential lot exemptions. And so we just laid out that lots of less than 17,000 square feet in single-family residential zones are exempt. They have the greatest share of tree canopy cover in the city. Collectively, those residential zones. And a large portion of lots are below the exemption level and would not be subject to the code. The options before the committee are to retain the 17,000 square foot residential lot exemption, amend to set it at 10,000 square feet, to consider an average lot size by zone, and to remove the lot size based residential exception. So that was actually, I'm looking at the minutes rather than the packet, excuse me, but that is the summary of what the discussion was. So let me get to the packet. Thank you for bearing with me. So here we are in the latest version of the draft report. So we have retained 17,000 square foot, amended to 10,000 square foot, remove the lot size based residential exemption, remove it together with incentives to make it easier to retain trees. And that's key issue number 12 is the incentive structure. So those are the options that we brought back to the committee based on your discussion.
Mr.
Ellie?
Billingsley has a hand raised.
Yeah, I think where we got hung up last time is perhaps some of us hadn't read all the way through the package to see that we were going to talk about incentives as we move down through this process. And I think the consensus was that we want to get rid of the lot exemption size. However, we couldn't get a majority just because we didn't know what the exemptions were going to look like. And some felt we were getting the cart before the horse. So, I think I would move that option number 4, that we remove the base lot size based on the exemptions that we're going to all clearly work on here in a short while, is the one that will get the majority of the votes. So I'll make a motion to approve that one.
Yes.
So Alan made
I
it
would,
first.
I would second that.
So it was moved by Alan, seconded by Jean, that I think it was item number 4, remove the lot size based residential exemption together with incentives in order to make it easier to retain trees, which is connected directly to key issue number 12. Chair Jackson, would you like to call for a vote?
Yes, unless there's other points of discussion, we could certainly call for a vote.
I
Okay.
can go down the list, Chair Jackson.
Okay.
Okay, so this would be option 4, which is the removal of the exemption with incentives. Okay, so Alan Billingsley, yay or nay?
Yay, yay.
Okay, is John here yet? John Bowman?
No.
Okay, Ed Brooks is excused. Ticomere Dunlap?
Yay.
Jean Ellers?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
We were asking if you wanted to vote yay or nay on the motion that you made a second to.
Well, yes, I'm sorry. I didn't hear that straight. Yes.
Yeah, great. Jesse is excused. Micah Glassstetter?
Yay.
Okay. Melissa Jackson?
Yay.
Okay. Hank Jones?
Yay.
Is Sean here at this time?
Yeah, I'm
Yes.
here. I know we're calling for a vote right now. I didn't really have an opportunity for any discussion prior to taking the vote. Can what was the 30-second recap on why we would be voting in favor of this again? Or am I
Would you
allowed
like,
to ask
would
for
you
that
like me to?
clarification?
No, that's fine. I'd be happy to speak to that. The
Thanks, Rich.
clarification is that we're clearly going to work on the exemptions after we decide that we're going to remove the, we're going to work on the incentives after we remove the exemption. If we don't remove the exemption, then incentives may or may not have something to do with it.
Okay. I mean, without any guarantee that there actually be incentives that are approved at the later discussion, I'm going to vote no.
Maya, Neff,
Yay.
and then Denise Nicole Franklin.
I have the same question as Sean, just for clarity. Have we not discussed the incentives for this option at all?
Lisa,
Yeah.
would it be okay if I shared my screen? I have the incentives pulled up. That way we can just quickly go.
Thank you.
over it. I think that might be helpful. So here in the packet, beginning on page 27, we've identified some potential amendments for incentives, which would be directly connected to the removal of these exemptions. We're taking these in individual steps. So it would be forwarded to the city council under the existing motion that the removal of the residential lot-based exemption would be contingent on the incorporation of some of these incentives. And then we will go through the incentives after we approve this first phase. As a quick snapshot, we have a density bonus, alternative setbacks for height, and the development standards to protect significant trees, alternative parking standards, modification for density, and then for stormwater standards.
Thank you for sharing that. I just wanted to clarify if they were just matched per each item that we were voting on. So I vote yay.
Okay. And with that, we have a majority yay.
Okay.
So the next item, I will share my screen. It's also in your packet. Is the industrial zoned properties. So since 2019, industrially zoned properties have been exempted from the tree protection code, except where specific tree preservation is required as a mitigation under the State Environmental Policy Act or SEPA. Industrially zoned properties contain about 3% of the citywide tree canopy. About 12.1% of the zoning district has tree canopy. And since 2010, this zone has had a near 1% loss of tree canopy. And that information was shared on the March meeting materials. There have been permit applications for industrial buildings that have been reviewed under SEPA regarding impacts to trees, including Gary Oaks, which is a native tree considered part of fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas under critical area regulations. The permits have engendered public comments and appeals. Some permit appeal information and examples of the loss of trees have been shared with the committee through public comment. The options under this key issue number 3 are: 1, retain the current industrially zoned property exemption and rely on the State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA. Remove the industrially zoned property exemption. And 3, remove the industrially zoned property exemption together with incentives to make it easier to retain trees. Courtney just shared those list of exemptions together. They basically were a list of code sections in the Lakewood Municipal Code that were both for residential, commercial, and industrial zones, and then particular areas of the city like downtown or the station area. And then citywide would be things related to stormwater. So that was a list of exemptions that kind of fit the categories of incentives that were presented to you in prior meetings.
Does anyone have comment or? I would like to throw out to the committee that I think if our goal is to increase our trees and maintain the better trees that we do have, I think that no matter where the tree sits, the tree should have some form of protection, whether that be an industrial area, residential area. So I would move for item number 3 that we remove the industrial zone property exemptions, along with some incentives for builders to be able to retain the trees.
Chair Jackson, Mr. Billingsley has his hand raised, followed by,
I will second the movement. I mean, it's a 3% of what we're trying to accomplish, but what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And imagine the flack that will occur if we say, if you're big enough, you're exempt. But a little tiny lot owner, we're gonna have you, move your building over a little bit to save that tree. So I'm all for it, and I'll second the motion.
so it has been moved by Chair Jackson and seconded by Mr. Billingsley to move forward with item number 3 or option number 3 under key issue number 3 to remove the industrially zoned property exemption together with incentives to make it easier to retain trees. Chair Jackson, you can open it for discussion.
Okay.
Well, I thought we would probably need to have discussion before we finalize to make a motion to move anything, is what I thought, but that's okay. I just want to be clear that whatever decision, are you hearing me okay?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to be clear that whatever the decisions are in terms of trees and industry, that trees need to have a place and a space, and they need to be protected, and all else that we do to maintain our trees. And I have seen far too many times industry moves in, trees go away, chopped down, assaulted, as far as I'm concerned. So we need to be sure that the protections are there for the trees, regardless to what kind of tree it is.
Did Micah Glassstetter have his hand up before?
He did. I do not see it raised currently. Chair, an active motion on the table.
Okay, is there any other comments or thoughts on this before we move to a vote? Okay, it appears
Looks
we're
like
ready.
Micah Glassstetter has his hand raised.
Oh, Micah's back. Okay.
I think he may have lost connection.
Micah, are you muted?
Sorry. What happened was I switched from my phone to my iPad. So can you hear me okay now?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yep, my hand was raised earlier just to second the motion. I believe in all of the incentive win-win situations, so looking forward to discussing that.
Okay, thank you, Micah. Any other comments? Okay, so we will move forward to a vote.
Okay. So we have first and second for option 3, removal of the exemption for industrially zoned properties with incentives. Alan Billingsley, yea or nay?
Okay,
Has John Boatman arrived? Nope. Okay, Tico Mira Dunlap. Tico Mira, if you're muted, unmute and let us know. I think his connection was a little squirrely there. Ticomir, can you repeat
Yay.
your yay?
Yay.
Okay. Jean Ellers,
Yay.
Jesse Campbell is excused. Micah Glassstetter,
Yay.
Melissa Jackson,
Yay.
Hank Jones,
Yay.
Sean Martin.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yay.
Thank you. Maya Neff.
Yay.
Okay. And Denise Nicole Franklin. Denise, are you unmuted?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So Chair, if this sounds good, we'll move to key issue number 4.
Yes.
Okay. This is about easements and rights of way. The current code exempts tree removal and easements and rights of way for purposes of installing and maintaining infrastructure. This could be power, gas, water, sewer, stormwater. For example, provided there is a notification to the city. The tree canopy assessment found a net loss over 10 years of trees and rights of way. Rights of way are an opportunity to add tree canopy in appropriate locations. There was the information about tree canopy by zone or public or private lands on March 29th. We did have some stakeholder interviews that Jonathan helped conduct with Lakewood Public Works and Lakeview Power and Light, and who indicated that primarily they maintain trees. They try not to remove them unless there's an unhealthy or unsafe condition. They hire expertise to help determine health safety, such as certified arborists. They would like to make sure that the appropriate tree types are included in the rights of way to make sure that it is helpful for long-term maintenance and health and safety. The options, oh, Courtney, would you like to add to that?
Just quickly, I would like to give some background knowledge that in the last couple of years, we've seen at least 2 instances where trees have been excessively limbed, I think, for most folks' standards. Our code does not currently define pruning and limbing in such a way that is maybe as effective as we'd like to see, even for utility companies. So although they mention that they are doing it just for tree maintenance, this may be another opportunity in order to make note that we do need to amp up those definitions in order to make the standards clearer for everyone.
Thank you, Courtney. This committee also discussed in prior meetings either retaining the exemption with notification or removing it and treating public rights of way and utilities as similar to private parcels. So that would mean if you were to act similar to the residential and industrial exemptions, if you were to remove it, you would apply some similar standards and you would provide for some kind of simple permit beyond a notification, some kind of affidavit or self-certification that they meet the code criteria. And there's a space here if the committee comes up with some other option.
Okay, points of discussion?
Looks like Micah Glassstetter and then John Ellers.
So my personal experience with this, I have seen primarily that they are very responsible. They're very resistant to people asking for a tree to be removed just because it's in the right of way or just because there's branches over the power lines. So I don't really see a need to remove the exemption, but I do respect what Courtney brought up. I'm just not aware of any situation where they've over pruned a tree just because it's in the right of way. They seem to be pretty minimalist when it comes to clearing power lines.
Jean?
I have personal testimony about what happens with trees. Our backyard, we're right here at the golf course, the Frisbee golf course. And I can assure you, I have the oddest looking trees in my backyard. We brought in people to prune the trees, and I came home from work to discover what was going on and put a halt to it immediately. I think on private lands, residential lands, when there are such things as overhangs and so forth, I can't help but go back to the question, which was there first, the tree or the power lines? Someone need to be more careful about where they're placing their power lines, and so not to interfere with the normal growth of a tree and have it looking like flying saucers or some such strange thing. That's my first and sincere comment. There sometimes, although we mean well, we want things to be just right, sometimes we aren't real thoughtful about the overall appearance too of that tree once we have hacked it. And the next comment is about self-certification. That's just silly language to put into a code as far as I'm concerned. And I have some extensive experience with what happens with self-cert. And people tend to forget that somewhere along the way, someone may have to monitor what has gone on, only to find that they're not being honorable. So I would delete that language. I wouldn't even have it be part of it. We want to stand well with the community, but we're not playing games here either with the trees and so forth. So the self-cert, I think, it's not a good idea. If you need an example, how about looking at the insulation in walls? Self-certing. You go out to do an inspection, what do you find? There's a front. They've taken one bat of the insulation and it's securing about 3 or 4 openings where someone was being clever. And so it's not a good idea. I would say let's not use the term with self-certification, because people's honor is sometimes in trouble. Thank you.
Melissa Jackson.
I agree with Jean. I have personal experience here in my own yard where the utility company came across the back and topped my spruce trees. There were 40-year-old spruce trees lining along the back, and instead of trimming them, they topped them, therefore killing 15 trees that were about 40 years old. So I think I agree with you, Jean, in that I like taking away the self-certification language. I think there should be some monitoring by an arborist, possibly one certified by the city, to monitor how these trees are trimmed. I understand that sometimes they need to be trimmed, but they can be done in a way that is both attractive and good for the tree.
Right.
Courtney, do you have something to add in terms of information?
Yeah, I just wanted to provide some clarification on the idea of self-certification. And if I could share my screen just as an example of where we came up with this idea. So the city of Sumner, granted, fences are not the same as trees, but they provide something for fence installation that basically is a one-page handout that summarizes the code. And then individuals submit this to the city, certifying that they understand what the requirements are. And then this would in turn become a permit. So right now, for example, removing the lot size exemption for single-family residential lots, this would be a streamlined process for self-certifying. Yes, we recognize what your code says, but now the city has records of it. Depending on where we go later on with some of the recommendations, if there is available staff, inspections would be able to take place because we would have record of these different types of activities. So when we're talking about self-certification, we aren't necessarily saying that they're, unless you choose to move forward with exempting them, we're not necessarily saying that they're completely exempt. We're saying that there is some sort of streamlined process for them to be able to provide the city with notification.
I believe Tico Mayor had his hand up. Tico Mayor, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Can I share my screen for an image real quick?
Sure.
One second. So not sure if you can see this, but this is, I just want to point out that this is an oak that was supposedly trimmed behind the Black Angus restaurant
Yeah.
in August. And I just want to say that this is like mutilation of the tree.
Yeah.
And obviously, in terms of the mass of the tree, that there's a bunch underground as well. So if you trim it like this, the canopy, well, there's nothing really left of the canopy anymore. So the roots aren't going to be supported anymore, and this is the tree is gonna die. And this was supposed to be in accordance with the tree code. So I think the code enforcement officer, Dunn, I believe, said that this was all right, and this was not a violation of the code. So I just wanted to share these images. And also another tree. This is a tree by Custer Elementary School that had a similar thing happen to it. And this was because of power lines. So I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you. Micah, it looks like you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I was going to say something in line with what Tikamir brought out. I'm really glad he shared that photo. That actually wasn't performed by, the second one was because the installation of the power lines. The first one behind Black Angus was just because they wanted to. And that is one of my questions, because we talked about residential, we talked about industrial. There's a lot of really, really poor pruning and hack jobs being done on commercial property. Sometimes it's just because the owner says, I want people to be able to see my sign. And some it's just they don't want to rake leaves. But I don't know that we're addressing that. I would love to address that, because those exact trees were something that definitely I wanted to discuss as well. And recently over by the Lakewood Motor Inn, on their property, they also did a horrible mutilation of all of their Gary oaks. I actually bid that job in order to prune them properly. They brought in another tree service, and certainly they're right to do so. But because we don't have a city arborist, we don't have somebody to say, hey, this is okay, this is not okay. This is what's being perpetrated on these oak trees. And if there's not some sort of meaningful protection for what people are allowed and not allowed to do when it comes to pruning these big majestic trees, it's just going to happen more and more. But the most egregious one that I've seen, I would agree, Tikamir pointed that out. I saw it when it happened on that commercial property behind the Black Angus. I would say, I think it's 4 total, and they'll never be the same. And I imagine that some of them will die completely, but even if they do live, they're always just going to be horrible looking poles, a little bit of brush on top.
Denise, you had your hand up there for a while.
I did. Micah kind of answered that for me. The one behind Custer Elementary School, I'm not an arborist by any means, but you can tell like they mutilated that tree, so they didn't have to come back and, touch it up again. It's like that one and done. It's disheartening, but to Micah's point, it's why we're here to write things like that in the code, to where it's a responsibility to, take care of our trees in our community. It's a disservice, especially it's at an elementary school. And my 7-year-old just came down and he's like, how can I be a part of this? Like, that's you're showing bad behavior to our trees already at an elementary school. And it's very disheartening as a parent to see that happening right there, that mutilation. So thank you, Micah, for touching on that, because you answered my question. So that's why I put my hand down.
So Chair, I didn't see any other hands raised, but, oh, Jean, go ahead.
I just want to restate the value of having adequate certification that what we need to have done is going to get done. And again, I can't tell you how seriously it is. What kind of a potential issue it can be when you allow people to make their own judgments, i.e. self-certifying. It just, seriously, I'm saying what I understand to be, what I know to be a fact. Facts change. And lastly, I'm hoping that with everything that we do, we haven't touched on, and this is a little off the subject maybe, but I'll risk it and say, I hope that we touch on more education for our community. People don't really understand the trees and our lives, the air we breathe. You know, I know that we know it in our minds somewhere, we learned it in school, but they don't realize how very important that step is. So, and amongst everything else that we are looking at, options and so forth, please, let's not oversight how we plan to, in fact, educate our community and maybe even the state at large. But we need to start where we are, which is good. Thank you.
I was hearing two things that might result in amendments to option 2 or become a third option. One is I would suggest that rather than describe the simple permit, we're just about to get into key issue 5 with what a permit process looks like. And so we can just maybe take the details out here as one idea. Another that I was hearing is that there needs to be some standards for trimming and pruning related to the public or utility exemption. And so that could be added to number 2, or like I said, this could become another option. It looks like Ticomir Dunlap and then Denise Nicole Franklin.
Oh, I just wanted to thank Jean for talking about education. Like, education is important, but I also want to ask, I disconnected a while back and reconnected, and I can't turn on my video now. So I don't think I'm co-host. So I was wondering if you could enable my video. Oh. Thank you.
Denise?
Going back to something that Micah mentioned earlier, when it comes to the bid process and not having like a city arborist, maybe like recommending that there is, protection language that is, maybe the certification is that they have to take a certain type of education course that teaches them how to properly trim a Gary oak tree, or protection certification, just so that way we are adding that in the bid process. Because if somebody's going to go for the most affordable bidder that's going to mutilate these trees, we're defeating the purpose. But maybe, the city has a responsibility to add that into the bid process or something. I'm not sure. Just a suggestion.
I believe we've understood from Planet Geo is that there are, standards, code of practice for certified arborists. So perhaps the language in the code can be more clear about certification expectations. Maya, Neff?
Yeah, to build a little bit on what Denise said, Pierce County as a whole, if I remember correctly, has a set of tree companies and arborists that they allow to do work within 10 feet of a power line. I'm guessing that Lakewood probably doesn't have anything that specific, but I remember that coming up at Northwest Trek when there were trees, and one of them that needed to be taken down was within that space. And the tree company is like, all right, we are on that list, but you're going to have to go through that process for us to come back and do that. So there was an extra layer for the people who would be working that close to utilities anyway. So maybe if that doesn't already exist, which I kind of doubt it does, it wouldn't be a bad idea.
I'm not aware of any such list existing, so we'll certainly report that.
Looks like Ticomir and then Melissa.
I just also wanted to mention regarding the trimming, one should probably also have permits for trimming. Like in the pictures I showed before, like obviously it's not quite as bad as cutting down the tree all the way, but it's like 3/4 of the tree is gone. So I think one should have to have a permit in order to cut down a tree, and potentially also have fines if it's trimmed in such a way that is destructive.
Melissa?
And similar to what Maya was saying, I think the idea of having a approved list of arborists provided by the city to the utility companies, that they choose from this list when they need to do something, to do trimming to a tree. I think that's a very good idea. I don't know if that's something we can put in the language here, or if that's something we would address later. It seems to me that we need to rework the wording on this option, and I don't know if that's something we want to try to do now or revisit the wording.
I'd like to pose just an idea in terms of how we're framing some of these conversations, because I know that for a lot of folks, one of the big issues is regarding Gary Oaks specifically, or if for some others, it may be every tree. And I think that what would be helpful for Lisa and I is, as we heard, maybe talking, I know that Oak Harbor has come up several times. Lisa and I, since our last conversation, has had an opportunity to speak with their planning staff and understand more about their process and the protections that they have. And one thing that I found interesting is that they have very strong protections in place for Gary Oaks specifically. There is a permit required to trim. Everything has to be reviewed by a certified arborist and monitored by a certified arborist. Staff is kind of left out, but they actually have no other protections for any other tree besides Gary Oaks. So all other trees are able to be removed. And they do distinguish that in their code. So they consider every Gary Oak to be a critical area that has the highest level of protection, and then all other trees can be removed. I want to just, as we go through some of these considerations, pose the question, are we talking more specifically about Gary Oaks because there is precedence and the ability to set out a separate set of requirements for a specific tree type, or are we looking at all species of significant trees? Do we want to distinguish between the two? And not to throw a huge wrench in kind of the format we've worked out, but I do think that there's two key issues at play here. And it might be helpful if we had that conversation now as we move forward. And maybe we have two sets of recommendations for a lot of these, Gary Oaks versus all, or all.
It looks like we have Jean and Sean and Denise and Micah with their hands raised.
I would recommend all trees. I recognize that the Gary Oak is a beautiful, vital old tree, but quite frankly, all of the trees are vital. And so that would be my position on that. The point that I raised the hand on had to do with having our state or our city's officials identifying qualified or eligible, if you will, industry to go out and do a job. I don't think that's a good place for us in terms of, I think that would shortcut or take away from people's value to put themselves out there, promote themselves versus depending upon our state government to be on their list. I don't think that's a good idea. I want very much for us to have some level of controls on what's going on, what is written, but I really think it would devastate our current state of affairs to list X number of quote unquote special arborist specialists when you have universities out there with people that are studying. There are any number of valued, reliable arborists. I just don't believe that that would be a good thing for our state to have its special list. I think that's an issue in my way of looking at things. I don't think our government needs to be appointing people to do jobs. That's for individuals to show themselves worthy and to prove their ability to take care of the needs, and not for the government to put a rubber stamp on them.
Sean?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, John, sorry, sounds a lot like Sean. I thought you were completed with your comment.
Oh, I am. Mhm.
Okay, thank you. Sean Martin?
Yeah, just speaking to John's last point, I've seen in some instances, it kind of sounds like what's being bandied about a little bit here in the red box is that's on the screen is like a registration program of some sorts. And I've seen that personally in the past, nothing to do with trees, but other city government programs that has negatively impacted the quality and selection of folks who are able to then provide the service that is required. So, and there's a lot more that goes. I mean, we could say, they have to be on a list, but there's a ton more that goes into that than just saying they should be on a list. It sounds like it's just a massive registration program at that point, or licensing program that now you're getting into requirements and, taking tests and renewing light just for this one specific subset of things. We're kind of concerned about creating some barriers that are going to hurt more than they help.
Thank you. Denise? And then Micah?
I was going to speak to that as well. Basically, a process to make sure that the system was equitable. You see it a lot in the construction industry, where there are lots of barriers to specifically women and minority-owned businesses. So I was going to speak to that fact as well. So thank you all for raising that point as well. But I also was going to say, tying that into an incentive for that, but there are lots of hurdles to making that happen in a short time frame that we have.
Thank you. Micah Glastetter?
I just wanted to clarify, the 10-foot rule has to do with safety around power lines, and there is no way around that. I am not qualified to work within 10 feet of a power line because I don't have a certification. A company like Asplund does, and they're hired by Puget Sound Energy, which is in Lakewood. Lakeview Power and Light does their own trimming. Same reason. You can't be within 10 feet of a power line without being certified that you're not going to kill yourself. Tacoma Power has their own linemen and their own tree crews as well. So those are two separate and distinct things between trimming around a power line and pruning a Gary oak that's on private or commercial property. And I do think that we should make a distinction. I think we should have special protection for Gary oaks, whether we're preventing them from being removed or ensuring that they're trimmed and pruned the proper way. Beyond that, I think that the way that our tree code applies to lots larger than 17,000 square feet is pretty sensible. You are allowed to remove a certain number of trees. Huge fir trees are not protected in the same way that the Gary oaks are. And I think that is sensible. So I think we should be talking about, as Courtney brought out, a distinction between Gary oaks and other trees and just tackling what we can. But I don't think we're going to change how the utility company prunes around power lines. That's pretty grandiose.
Denise?
Reviewing public comment as well. I just wanted to lift up into the space that a lot of the public comment is around Gary oak trees as well. So making sure that we bring their testimony in as well. So I agree with keeping it focused on Gary oak trees.
Well,
It looks like Micah and Melissa and John have more comment. Maybe after we hear from those folks, we could see if there's some kind of option that's forming here, or if we should bring that back for Thursday, because we do want to get to other Gary Oak portions, since we have our guest from WDFW here tonight.
I would like to move that we select option number 2 to remove the exemption and meet similar standards as on private, public, commercial parcels, but provide for a simple permit. Somewhere in the back of that, it would be nice to, and you would have to help me with the wording on this, but so that their permit process would be not too unlike that we would create a permit process for the utility companies. So however that would be worded up, because it will be different than the tree permit options that we are going to be moving on to.
So Chair Jackson, is this number 2, as I've been trying to modify it and meet what you're suggesting here?
Yes, and I really did like Micah's comment about the commercial lands. So I think that you'll hear again, we're talking about the utility companies in this particular section, but I think that I would move that they do not have an exemption and that they have to meet similar standards as other landowners do for how they trim and remove trees.
Courtney, did you want to make a clarification?
I think that we might just need a second motion that simply says we need to amend the definitions, or just we will take that as staff, that we need to amend the definitions of pruning and trimming, because right now commercial land is not exempt. Every tree removed needs a permit. It's just that the definitions for trimming and pruning are very open, and so they're not. There needs to be some additional language. I've seen canopy coverage as one of those options, for example, in Oak Harbor, where it's considered trimming or pruning if you maintain a certain amount of the canopy.
Okay, well, then I can rescind that motion then, and then instead move that we rewrite the options and look at them again on Thursday.
John and Micah, did you have anything more to say? John, first.
I just to add that we are aware that the giant maples are in trouble. I think that the Gary Oaks are special, but I also think the giant maples are special. And what about our state tree, the hemlock? You know, I think, I just don't, at this point, putting that language together, I'm not just sure how you would want that done, but I do believe that all of the trees need to be protected. And that's inclusive, of course, of the Gary Oak. So maybe even starting the sentence off with the Gary Oaks in addition to, or something to make it clear that we are going to protect the trees, period.
Micah?
So yeah, I do think we need to focus on what's going to be easiest. The nice thing about Gary's is they're very robust. They're easy to make safe. They're very long lived. They're worthy of protection. To bring other species in, and I'll just give you an example. I've planted 3 big leaf maples on my property. They're doing great. I absolutely love them. But in my experience, they're very prone to rot and decay. They can be very problematic to try to keep them safe. Hemlocks, they're very temperamental about change in the weather, change in drainage. You put in a golf course, the first thing that dies is almost every single hemlock. So that if we try to protect every single tree, we are going to lose our opportunity to protect the Gary Oak. To have good public education and sentiment towards increasing tree canopy, that's going to feel palatable to most people. But if we step in and say, hey, every tree is going to be protected, we're going to be seen as unreasonable.
Chair, I might suggest as you rescinded your motion and Courtney suggested we could come back with some updated options for the committee on Thursday. We might move into the skip over the tree permit process and come back to that and maybe get into the Gary Oaks, because it seems like that's a lot of what we've been talking about here.
Right, yeah.
Well, we have our guest from WDFW here. Okay, so we'll skip issue 5. We'll go to issue 6 about significant tree definition and critical areas with a focus on Gary Oaks. So right now the code sets the standard for a significant tree for any deciduous or evergreen tree at 9-inch diameter, or for Gary Oaks with a diameter of 6 inches measured at 4.5 feet above the ground. Gary Oak stands, not individual trees, are called out in the fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas. So we've shared some state definitions and example codes in the last couple of meetings, including your packet today. We've provided a link to the state's management recommendations for Gary Oaks. There's been a lot of public comment on that. There's been a range of setting a significant tree size for Gary Oaks ranging from 6 to 12 inches. And then typically across many tree types, there's 4 inches would be typically about the smallest. So our options, I'll just go over briefly, and then we can maybe have our guests weigh in on anything or have the committee share questions. So option 1 was to retain the current tree protection threshold at 6-inch diameter breast height threshold for Gary Oaks, retain the current critical area regulations that focus on oak tree stands, use the SEPA process to look at fish and wildlife habitat quality as needed. And then the second option is to do a tiered system of protection, retaining 6-inch diameter breast height for Gary Oaks as significant trees, requiring an arborist report with a certified plan, including a 3-to-1 replacement ratio, or in lieu payment into the tree fund. Recommend that Lakewood create an offsite replacement strategy. Part B of that tiered approach is to specify the size and quality of individual Gary Oaks, so not just stands, but individual oaks that would qualify as heritage trees at 15-inch with greater tree protection standards. And Courtney has shared earlier when we were talking about trimming and pruning, that similar to Oak Harbor, there could be a permit associated with that. And demonstration that there would be a reasonable use exception. And that if trees qualify as critical areas, there may be additional mitigation. And anything 20 inches or more would, regardless of stand size, would qualify as a fish and wildlife habitat conservation area and would need a reasonable use exemption. And we've cited to Pierce County as an example. So option 3 is the same as this tiered approach, but the threshold for significant trees would be at 4 inches instead of 6 inches. So it looks like we had some hands raised from Micah and Ticomir. Chair, would you like to go ahead and get their comments or questions in, or would you like our guests from WDFW to weigh in on items?
Well, they may have questions for him, or comments about these codes. So let's go ahead and let them speak real quick, and then we'll.
Okay. We have Micah Glastetter, then Ticomir, then Sean Martin.
Yeah, I think the only meaningful protection of Gary Oaks would be to lower the threshold to 4 inches DBH, because that's still a 20-year-old tree. So at the least.
Ticomir?
Yeah, I just was going to mention that 4 inches diameter at breast height still feels kind of like large to me. Like if you look at the population of Gary oak trees that are around, most of them are significantly larger than that, and there aren't very many small or medium-sized trees around. So even a tree that's 4 inches around is probably going to be several decades old potentially, depending on the conditions. So I feel like considering there aren't very many small trees to begin with, one should consider it having even less than 4 inches.
Sean Martin? You're muted.
I'm trying to draw upon my memory here and I'm just kind of blanking on it. Because there was some discussion kicked around about just having like a blanket protection of some sort for Gary oaks. So if there was some sort of system set up for that, whether it's around permitting or whatever, but just saying any Gary oak, I mean, does this kind of become non-applicable? Does this even matter at that point? Maybe I'm misremembering some prior conversations or sections here.
In Oak Harbor, it's any Gary oak over 6 feet is considered a critical area in itself. And so the permitting process for that, there's a trimming and pruning permit that is reviewed administratively. All other things go through the reasonable use exception process, which requires a public hearing in order to remove. So that might be what you're thinking of.
Okay. Yeah.
They though still have some type of definition. It's the 6 feet high. I would
6 inches, Courtney, is that what you mean?
they told me 6 feet high. Did you get told 6 inches? So we might have to go and verify that.
Yeah, we can verify that while we're maybe having some discussion from.
I'm very interested to hear though from Mr. Masters regarding what you see as a best practice in terms of the range in DBH to determine a significant tree. I know that WDFW has been doing some work on this more recently in terms of updating your own policies and procedures. Any new available information that might be privy to this conversation as we move forward with these recommendations?
I don't have any new information. I will say that, a revision of our priority habitats and species management recommendations for Gary oak is a higher priority now. So we want to kind of redefine our management recommendations because they largely, they were written in 1998. And so they're largely focused on natural areas where there is sort of that woodland transition between a forested habitat and say prairie land or other type of ecosystem. So that doesn't really translate into the urban setting. And so between myself and my supervisor, we've been able to get our PHS department to sort of up that definition, up a revision of that on the plans for the next year or so. So it's not going to go very fast, but it is a higher priority for us to do that. With that in mind, I would think when I think of applying requirements for the critical area ordinance within an urban landscape, I would like to have some references towards, how are these trees fitted in the landscape? Are they single trees, not really contributing to other stands nearby? And, how complex are the canopies, that sort of thing, to try to get a good idea of where, of kind of what we're looking at in terms of what's available in the city and what we should, think about removing versus preserving.
Sean, did you have a new question?
No, just kind of following up. I mean, as I look at the options here laid out, I would tend to lean towards, I think option 2 or a 3 of 2. would seem to be a little more flexible for, I don't know. I mean, the SEPA stuff, I don't know enough about SEPA other than sometimes it can be extremely arduous for situations in which it's really not intended, or so seeing SEPA and thinking about trimming a tree on my front yard kind of seems like overkill to me.
Okay, Alan Billingsley?
Yeah, I'm just gonna chime in on the 4-inch diameter tree rally here. I have close to 100 Gary oaks on my property, and I have 7 or 8 4-inchers that I have tried to nurture along now for 40 years, and they haven't gotten much bigger. So 4 inches can be a very, very old tree. And I have ones that I've planted that are only 6 feet tall that are 10 years old. So 4 inches, like they said, can be a very, very old tree already.
Do we have any other questions? Courtney, were you about to say something? Okay. Micah Glassstetter?
I was going to make another point too, that I've seen a lot of people who are interested in helping their Gary oaks to thrive, and they will actually remove a fir tree that's towering over or kind of trapping the Gary oak from growing. So that's it. I just want to throw that out into the discussion as well. Sometimes in order to help keep a Gary oak healthy, sometimes it is necessary to remove other trees around it that are intertwined or towering over. And I've seen a lot of good results from that. So just wanted to throw that in the mix.
So are we ready for a motion there, Chairman?
Well, I wasn't quite sure if that's what Sean was doing, if it was a motion or if we're ready to move on. Before we do, does anyone have any additional questions for Mr. Masters? I might pipe in real quick and ask Mr. Masters, in a perfect world, if you were writing tree codes for the city of Lakewood, what would your choice be for the diameter size?
Well, I agree with Micah. Smaller trees are very old, or can be pretty old, and their growth rate is really slow. So, we kind of need these smaller trees for recruitment, over the years into the larger trees, sort of the mature trees. And I think that trying to come up with a plan to preserve as small a diameter as possible would be a good way to go.
Okay.
Because once these large trees are gone, a 200-year-old tree, you're not going to replace that with any sort of mitigation.
Chair, it looks like Jean Ellers has her hand up.
I simply agree with how the discussion goes at this point about the size of the tree not necessarily being relative to its age, because it could look like a switch and be quite old. At least that's from my little experience here. A single tree, Gary oak or otherwise, doesn't necessarily, in my understanding, doesn't necessarily mean that it will continue to be that way. Somehow I tend to see the Gary oaks and many other oaks in terms of families. It may be that one, but if you look closely, you may find something else is brewing. So I think a single Gary oak would need to be protected as well. But we really do need to, I don't know about the sacrifice tree. That's what it all sounds like to me. We will sacrifice to save the Gary oaks. All the other trees have their value, their worth. I mean, they're giving back to the soil. They're helping to with the carbon dioxide and so forth, transitioning us back to oxygen. I think, and I think with the variety of trees, there will obviously be some things that will take place that will be different one from the next in terms of benefits to us, human beings, and what we need for life to sustain ourselves in life. I put Gary Oak first. However, we need to come up with the correct verbiage to identify the other trees because they're in this as well. Thank you.
Chair Jackson?
Yes, there was some language, I believe it was farther up, that addressed the other trees. Am I imagining that? Where the Gary Oaks were one size and then other trees were a different size for protection. Am I imagining that from earlier or higher up? Didn't we have some language? Or was it just this whole section was
I
just
think the next key issue 7 was to address heritage tree, historical tree program. We didn't have a specific size in mind for the heritage tree, but this would be forwarded to the city planning commission and council to help determine that.
Slightly higher as well, Lisa, on page 5 or page
okay.
document 21 of the total document at the bottom. You did define what's currently there for any of the
Correct.
evergreen trees.
Deciduous and evergreen trees are at 9-inch diameter.
Okay, so if we were in this section that we are voting on right now, we are just specifically discussing Gary Oaks, but later we will also be discussing what our definition of a historical tree is.
Right.
So if we just, okay, to Jean's point that, there are other trees as well. And so, this is just for the purposes of the Gary Oak, this particular section.
Correct.
I don't know if anyone would be comfortable going even lower in the inches threshold for the Gary Oaks. I'm going to throw that out as a discussion point before we vote.
I'd be curious to hear from Mr. Masters or anyone else that may know more about Gary Oaks than I do. At what point does a DBH translate into a height? And I'm thinking of it simply from an enforcement perspective. If at 1 or 2 inches, we would never know it was there in the first place. It's very difficult for us to enforce. Certainly, I see the meaning behind having a code that, for example, would protect every Gary Oak, and that's just how it is. But in terms of enforcement, at what point does the tree height, rate? Micah, do you know? You popped on.
Yeah, it's basically its resources. So if it doesn't have as much sunshine and water in its location, it's going to grow a lot slower. A lot of people don't realize that the majority of fir trees in any single lot, largely they're the same age. If you go all across Anderson Island, there's stands of trees where the 3-foot diameter fir is the same age as a 2-inch diameter fir. And I'm literally not kidding. I can show you medallions that are cross-cut out of these understory firs that have 80 rings in them and are smaller than the palm of your hand. So yeah, you can have a super old Gary Oak if it's just been dominated by other trees or is growing in a very tight stand. They don't get really big, and I've seen them get pretty large where they have, well-drained soil, plenty of water, good nutrition. So it's really hard to tell by looking.
Do you know what size at a nursery is most available? From what I've seen, I have a couple near my home. I see a lot of 1-inch.
Gary Oaks primarily are grown in Oregon and nurseries in Oregon. In fact, Joel Kaczmarek, who takes care of, or he's a superintendent at Tacoma Golf and Country, he buys Gary Oaks and he's planting them all over the country club. And the largest he can get is a 3-inch diameter. And that's probably because it is grown in clay soil out in the sunshine plains of Oregon. They might be relatively young. but they're at least, I would say, at least 15 years old under the most ideal conditions. And they're about 20 feet tall, 3-inch caliper.
Micah, you were cutting out there.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the 3-inch caliper are about 15 to 20 years old. The only nurseries that sell Gary Oaks commercially grow them in Oregon. There's no one in Washington that does it. They might retail here. I've never seen them, even in Portland Avenue Nursery. I've never seen a Gary Oak. You kind of have to special order them. They can only dig them up a certain time of year. And I know most of what I know about buying Gary Oaks from Joel Kaczmarek at Tacoma Country and Golf, because he buys them as much wherever he can find room. He sticks them on his golf course.
Yeah, I was referring to other tree species being 1 to 2 inches that I see at nurseries. And so for Gary Oaks, are they commercial?
Okay,
1 to 2 inches or 3 inches or?
So typically they're 5 to 10-year-old trees if they're 2 to 3-inch caliper.
Okay, so
other species
would be 2 to 3 inches. Okay.
Yeah.
Maya, enough?
Yeah, I was going to second a lot of what Micah said in terms of, if you have a large stand of trees, there are going to be some ones that are the same age and going to be really, really skinny in comparison. At Lakewood, I think most of our Gary Oaks are probably the same age, but they vary a fair bit in terms of diameter. And then I bought a Gary Oak from Portland Avenue Nursery last fall. I think my timing was just amazing on it. And it's about 6 feet tall, probably an inch caliper. And yeah, it's probably like 10 to 15 years old, but I was apparently very lucky to find it. And that's pretty much it.
So I think everybody that has their hands up has spoken except for Alan.
Just a short one. I propagate Gary Oaks constantly over here out of our own acorns. And the issue with propagating them is that the taproot in 1 year is already 2 feet into the ground. So they're very hard to get going in pots. But I think we're ready to make a motion here. I think most people are leaning towards at least a 4-inch recommendation for the Gary Oaks as a threshold. So I'm going to move that we accept option number 3 that includes all of the tiers above, but changes it to a 4-inch threshold to become a significant tree.
Maya?
I second that.
What has been moved by Alan and seconded by Maya that we adopt option 3 for key issue number 6. Chair, I'll turn it to you for discussion.
Okay, is there any other discussion to this before we go to a vote?
I would like to say maybe we should make it less than 4 inches.
Okay. Okay, without any other comments, I guess we move forward to vote.
Mr. Glassstetter has his hand up.
All right, Micah.
Oh, I was going to say, I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment of even lower diameter. However, to Courtney's point, there's a certain size you wouldn't even know it was there, and you wouldn't even know it was a Gary Oak. There'd be people who would just cut it down and take the risk. I mean, so a reasonable protection at 4 inches that includes everything else without, trying to reinvent the wheel is probably the most practical.
If there's no further comments, we'll go for a vote.
Okay. Alan Billingsley, yay or nay?
Yay.
John is still not with us. Ed is excused. Ticomir Dunlap.
Yay.
Okay. John Ellers. John Ellers. Yay.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah.
Yay. Okay. Micah Glastetter.
Yay.
Okay. Melissa Jackson.
Yay.
Hank Jones.
Yay.
Sean Martin.
Yay.
Maya Neff.
Yay.
Denise Nicole Franklin. Denise, you may be muted.
Yay.
Thank you. So Chair, we have about 7 minutes left. We can talk through either the permit process or a different topic to at least get maybe the options together, and some may be ready.
I was wondering if, I think the permit part is going to take a little bit longer.
Mhm.
What if we were to move to the next one about historical heritage trees and maybe begin that discussion?
Sure.
Would everybody be okay with that? Jean, this speaks to the thing that you've been speaking to a number of times about the value of a tree. And so we can kind of see where everyone else weighs in on that.
Okay, Chair. This is key issue number 7, heritage tree, historical tree. The city could develop a heritage tree program. We cited to some examples with links in Puyallup, Lacey, Tumwater, and Poulsbo. Those programs offer higher protection standards, such as stricter avoidance or replacement ratios, or offer recognition incentives or education to exceptionally large or old trees. So we don't have a specific size in mind, but just this would direct the city to develop such a program. And it would be option 1 could be to develop a heritage tree or historical tree program to recognize valuable and irreplaceable trees and offer incentives to property owners that participate. Option 2 is to not set up such a program, but rely on regulation of significant trees in critical areas to address functions and values of trees. Chair, it looks like Alan Billingsley has his hand up, and then Micah.
Very short, I would say, why would we not recommend that any specific tree have a heritage if it is truly a tree of heritage in our community?
Micah Glastetter, and then Maya Neff.
I agree too. You think of the experience of going through a park or going through Lakewood, to have that right in your own backyard and have that incentivized and have it to be a voluntary program where people, it just creates general excitement about having a big old tree in your yard. It's pretty similar to, and my neighbor does it right across the street, but it's these garden tours where people have unusual plants and really take pride in what they've grown in their yards. And it's part of this larger club, and people actually go around and tour on a certain day everybody else's garden. And so if it becomes something like that where there's just some sort of hoopla about it, I think there's plenty of people who would sign up for it.
Maya Neff.
Yeah, I think the developing a heritage tree or historical tree program would do wonders for education for the public and to help promote canopy growth. Because if you have a heritage tree that people can point to and be like, if you plant this to help our canopy, someday it will grow into this. I think could tie a couple of different goals together in a really, really fantastic way.
Chair Jackson.
I agree with all the previous comments. Why wouldn't we? The only thing I might change in the wording is let's also allow property or commercial property owners, industrial property owners to also participate in this program. If they have a historical tree on their land, we need to recognize those as well.
So you're suggesting commercial, is that?
Right. So for example, there was a beautiful oak tree over by Lakewood Bar and Grill. And the property owners, even though the tree cutting service tried to talk them out of cutting it down, cut it down anyway. It was probably one of the oldest oak trees in Lakewood. So if there was some sort of, if we made them look like good guys, or they had a special sign or a heritage tree sign, or we recognize that they had this on their property, it'd be a good PR opportunity as well.
Chair, I just wanted to clarify, property owners, for the way we wrote it, meant any property owner, whether it was residential or commercial or
Perfect.
industrial for that matter, any property owner.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. I wasn't sure if that was clarified.
Sure, no, that's great to clarify that. Ticomir Dunlop?
So I would, if I understood correctly, you would have heritage tree, or at least for Gary Oaks, have heritage trees at a certain diameter. I think it's probably important that trees that are above a certain diameter, it should be, the property owner should be informed that they have a heritage tree on their property. So just like people, in terms of education, people should know when they do have a heritage tree on their property.
So Chair, we're just a minute or two from the end here. We have one more hand raised from Jean Ellers. I just wanted to mention we might need an extra 5 or 10 minutes to finish. It seems like we're close on this one.
Okay.
Well, I can forgo my comment.
Jean, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that it's kind of frightening to think that people would not, with large pieces of property, would not, go hike out to see just what there is on their property. And how doable would that be to let someone know they've had the land, or it's somehow they're using it, and the owner might be aware, but the person who's about to build the structure may not be aware. I guess to me that's an interesting thought, and a good thought. Perhaps plaques or something. You have this on your, I don't know, some way to encourage the likelihood of success, further success of the tree, because no harm will be brought to it. But then for our heritage trees, that's true also, because the trees are just absolutely beautiful, all of them. And we are missing so many trees. Like I don't ever see elm trees anymore. There was a terrible situation back in Minnesota with the elm trees. And quite frankly, we years later tried to grow some here in Washington State, and nothing happened. So I don't know. Anyway, end of comment. I just thought, how would we let someone know what they have on their tree? If it's a big enough piece of land, I suppose, but how would we know? We'd have to keep record. And is that something we would want to do? Why would the government want to know what kind of trees you have on your property? I think this is an interesting position, the way I'm looking at it. I like for people with their private property, it's theirs. I don't think government needs to necessarily know what kind of tree you have on your property, but by the same token, to acknowledge the comment that was just made. If someone doesn't realize what they have, it would be good for them to realize it. So I think there's plenty of thought yet for that, but I'm not pro that we have to go out and start identifying each tree and write it down, and this is what you have, so take care of it. That's a little bit too, that's a harsh reality in my thinking. Thank you.
Chair, we have 3 more hands up. We have Alan Billingsley, Ticomir Dunlop, and Micah Glassstetter.
Okay.
I'm going to be quick. We're very close on this one. And all we're asking the city to do is develop a plan. So I'm going to move that we recommend that the city develop a plan, a heritage tree plan, and I'll make that motion.
Okay.
That motion.
Okay, John Ellers has seconded that motion.
Okay, it was moved by Alan and seconded by Jean for key issue number 7, option 1, to move forward. Chair, I will give it back to you for discussion.
Okay. Is there any further discussion on this topic before we go to a vote?
Mr. Dunlop does have his
oh.
hand raised, as does Mr. Glassstetter.
Okay.
I just quickly wanted to share just one more picture on the note of heritage trees. Second. So I just wanted to share this picture. I believe this is from 1917. It's a postcard of a Gary Oak. And in the caption text, it says, beautiful Washington, largest oak tree in the state near Tacoma. So this potentially could have been within what is now Lakewood. And this tree, I don't think it's around anymore, but just compared to the people there, it's kind of impressive how large Gary Oaks can get. So that's kind of an example of what, you know, would be a heritage tree.
Micah?
I was going to say, the way that I'm reading it, it does sound voluntary. There was some discussion as to where, you know, like, are we going to keep track of these? Or are we going to go on people's property and tell them that they have them? Is this or is this not a voluntary program for people to have their trees registered as historical?
It looks like some jurisdictions like Puyallup have it be more voluntary, kind of like a historic registry of a building. Others seem to apply higher protection standards, so they would have a regulatory approach. They would have stricter avoidance or replacement ratios for trees that are considered heritage level. They all seem to have some kind of way of having a recognition or incentive or education around it.
Okay, so basically, as the heritage program is developed, we'll figure, or the city council will figure out how that's the nuts and bolts of it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, are there any more hands raised? I can't see from my perspective.
Oh, Mr. Dunlop just raised his hand.
Oh,
Okay,
sorry, never mind.
okay. Okay, then I think with that, Lisa, we can go to a vote.
Okay. So this would be for option 1 to set up a program. All right. So yay or nay, Alan Billingsley?
Yay.
Okay. Ticomere Dunlop?
Yay.
Jean Ellers?
Yay.
Micah Glassstetter?
Yay.
Melissa Jackson?
Yay, and my cat would like to chime in too. Sorry.
Hank Jones?
Yay.
Sean Martin?
Yay.
Maya Neff?
Yay.
Denise Nicole Franklin?
Yay.
Okay, thank you. So Chair, I believe we've made it through about half of the issues between the last meeting and this meeting. So we need to go through the other half on Thursday. So
Okay,
Court and I will work on the option for the utility lines, but it might be good to see if folks that want to offer any alternative options to what's in the packet, that perhaps they could email Courtney and myself as to what those other options might look like. Courtney, did you want to add more there?
So the published packet will be more or less identical to what you already have. We'll just continue to work through these issues. And just to echo what Lisa said, please, if you have time, look through those remaining issues. And if there are gaps or things that you would like to see added, go ahead and send those over to us and we will incorporate them ahead of time as an option. That way, hopefully we can move through the remaining 6. I also wanted to just note that the Zoom link for the Thursday meeting will be different than the one that we have had thus far. I will be sending that out. So we will be sending just a refreshed agenda front page with that revised Zoom link, but all of your other packet materials will remain unchanged. And then ahead of that meeting, I'll send out that Zoom link again. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Otherwise, we hope to hear from each of you.
Okay. Thank you also to Mr. Masters for joining us tonight. Appreciate your input. And with that, I guess we end the meeting.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We'll see you all on Thursday.